Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to continue our discussion of slavery and inequality in Western civilization. As always, there are some terms that you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is over, as well as some questions that you should be able to answer by the time you get to the last slide. So let's get to it. The year is 1619 and the place is Jamestown, Virginia. A Dutch warship shows up in the harbor at Jamestown. This is the first English colony in Virginia. The ship's crew has asked to trade for food and supplies. Well, what did the Dutch have to trade? 20 African men. They had seized the Africans from a Spanish slave ship. Now, we don't know much about the Dutch or their ship. We do know, however, that the colonists at Jamestown agreed to trade food for the Africans. The Dutch set sail, leaving their cargo behind. But that's not all they left behind. They also left behind a mystery. 500 years later, we still have no idea who these Africans were. Now, we might make assumptions about who they were, however, based on what we already know. For example, we know that the Africans had been taken as slaves by the Spanish. We also know that Virginia will one day be a slave-holding society. Thus, we can assume that these men were slaves in Virginia, right? Not quite. This story leaves behind so many questions. If the Africans had been sold to the colonists as slaves, for example, where did the colonists get the idea that enslaving other human beings was okay? And if they weren't slaves, then what were they? To gain a better understanding, we need to understand a bit more about the notions of slavery and inequality in the 17th century. In the year 1619, Western civilization is just leaving the late Middle Ages. During the late Middle Ages, society was structured around something known as feudalism. Feudalism was a system of relationships and obligations. This chart illustrates those relationships and obligations. At the top was the king and the nobility. They controlled most of the land within Western civilization, and back then, land equaled wealth and power. Now, the king won the loyalty of the nobility by giving them grants of land. The nobles would give some of that land to knights or professional warriors, who would then provide protection in exchange for that land. You'll notice that at the very bottom of this society were the peasants, who grew all of the food and did most of the work to keep the system afloat. Peasants were grouped together in small communities called manors. Now, not all peasants were created equal. The people at the bottom of this pyramid, the peasants, were actually divided into two broad groups. Some peasants, in fact, were free. They owned their own land, and they could come and go as they pleased. Most peasants, however, qualified as serfs. Serfs were similar to slaves in that they owed labor to the nobles who owned their land. But it didn't stop there. A serf needed permission from his lord to leave his manor. He was not allowed to marry anyone outside the manor either. Moreover, the status of being a serf was passed down from one generation to the next. In other words, if you were a serf, your son and your daughters would be serfs, and their sons and daughters would be serfs, and so on and so forth. In other words, the status was inherited. Now, why talk about serfs when the topic of our lecture is supposed to be slavery? Well, the point is that the existence of serfs and serfdom in Western civilization shows that European society accepted inequality as a fact of life. Some people were simply meant to work for others. Some people were better than others. The people back then had no concept of, quote, all men being created equal, unquote. In fact, they would have found such a statement to be laughable. But as I said above, Europe is beginning to move out of the Middle Ages by 1600. The practice of serfdom had ended in many parts of Western civilization. However, inequality was still the rule. A good example of this was something called indentured servitude. A good way to think of indentured servitude is to think of it as temporary slavery. That's because under indentured servitude, a free young man or woman would sell him or herself to a wealthy individual in exchange for job training, shelter, or cash. Under the terms of their contract, they would work for their owner for a set period of time. After that time, they would be freed. Indentured servitude existed in Europe before the establishment of the American colonies. However, it was in America that indentured servitude really took off. Wealthy colonists needed workers on their tobacco and sugar plantations. Indentured servitude filled that need. All a wealthy individual had to do was to make a contract with a poor free person back home, back in England. The wealthy person would buy a ticket for that individual on a ship sailing for America. Now, once that individual arrived in America, they would work off that ticket by working for the wealthy individual for a period of years, a set period of years. In the 1600s, 2/3 of all laborers in America were actually indentured servants. That's because while African slavery did exist at this time, most colonial landowners preferred working with indentured Europeans. Why? Well, if you happened to get an indentured servant from your own country, then that individual spoke the language. They understood your culture. Moreover, indentured servants were often cheaper than slaves. This also made them an attractive buy. It could be a very tough life to be an indentured servant. Many indentured servants in America died before their contract expired. Some were worked to death by their masters. Others found their situation so difficult that they would try to run away into the American wilderness. In fact, runaway servants was a common problem in America. Runaways, if they were recaptured, could be whipped or have their contract extended. Others were executed by hanging. So let's return to those 20 Africans sold to colonists at Jamestown in 1619. While it is possible they were sold as slaves, it's also possible they were sold as indentured servants. There is evidence that some indentured servants were Africans. These servants gained their freedom, and some even went on to own their own indentured servants. Some even owned slaves themselves. Yet, no matter what the status of those 20 Africans was, it is clear that slavery and inequality were a part of Western civilization. Slavery in Western civilization dates back to before the ancient Greeks. The Romans also held slaves, and slavery continued after the fall of Rome. Most slaves were taken as captives in battle. Nor was slavery new to Africa. Slavery had existed in Africa for thousands of years, dating back to before the Egyptians. Initially, slaves stayed on the continent. However, when the Arabs took over the trade after 1000 CE, African slaves were sold across the Middle East and into the Indian Ocean. The European connection to the African slave trade began with the Spanish and the Portuguese explorations of America in the 15th and 16th centuries. Both nations were importing large numbers of African slaves to work on their plantations and in their gold and silver mines. No European power is guiltless in the slave trade, however. Nations who were active in colonizing the Americas bought and sold slaves. Why? Well, as we said earlier, there was a need for labor in America, especially on the large sugar, rice, and tobacco plantations of the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American Southeast. Historians do not know how many Africans were kidnapped and forced into slavery, but they estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, about 12 million Africans were brought to America. The trip to America was a harrowing one. It was known as the Middle Passage, and it was a voyage, of horrors for most Africans. The slaves were treated as cargo and crammed into the slave ships. Many got sick along the way. Some starved to death. In fact, there's an estimate that at least 4 million, or 5 to 20% of all slaves, died en route to America. Some died from disease. Others killed themselves. Still others were simply thrown overboard if it was expected that they might not fetch a good price in the New World. That's why so many Africans did not survive the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas. But the Europeans kept at it. That's because slavery proved to be highly profitable. Just as an example, between 1761 and 1800, African slaves to the Americas accounted for more than 4/5 of all the products produced in the Americas. 80% of everything produced in the Americas came as a result of slave labor. That's an incredibly profitable system, as long as you're not a slave. Slavery had another advantage, however, if you were not a slave, that is. An indentured servant who ran away could easily blend into the surrounding society. That was harder for an African whose race marked his status as that of a servant or a slave. Thus, by the end of the 1600s, slavery increasingly came to be associated with skin color. The purpose of this lecture was to illustrate that to people living in 1648, inequality was a fact of life. Some people were destined to work for others. It was argued that this was what God had commanded. The very notion of human dignity and equal rights had never entered their minds.